And I apologize just to begin. I'm going to start by rehashing some early childhood trauma on my part. I'm going to take you all the way back to grade 1 to one of the most humiliating moments in my life. Just to give you a little bit of context, when you're just a young boy, 6, 7 years old, probably the most pressing political debate that you can be involved in. It's not, things about climate policy or Middle Eastern policy or who's going to be the next prime minister or anything like that. It's really whose dad can beat up who, right? Who's got the strongest dad? I don't know if any of you remember being a little kid having these debates about who they thought's dad was the strongest. And I can remember some of these debates, like my dad is a cop, my dad is, ex-military, my dad's like 6'6". My dad, you should see my dad's gun collection or my dad's got a medieval axe collection. Now, poor me, you might think it's bad because my dad was a Baptist pastor, kind of like myself, so I didn't really do well in the debate. But what I like to say is, my dad's job is to scare the hell out of people. So that was I wish I was that clever to come up with that when I was about 6 years old, but sadly I wasn't quite that clever. Well, obviously when you're a kid, the problem is the likelihood, when you're at school and there's a bully on the school ground, your dad coming to your defense is not very likely. So what you really spent a lot of time arguing was, well, who had the biggest, strongest sibling in the school that you could call to help you out if you ever got in trouble. And for me, I was fortunate because my older brother was nearly 7 years older than I am. So when I was in grade 1, he was in grade 8. So I used to say, my brother is, he's in junior high, he's grade 8. So people are like, whoa, don't mess with Jeff because he's got a big brother here. He's one of the big kids in the school. The unfortunate problem is one day we were walking by like my, grade 1 class, and we passed my brother's class in the hallway, and I made the mistake of saying, hi, Ken. And they're like, who's that? I'm like, oh, that's my brother. He just happened to be about the smallest kid in grade 8. I mean, he was probably more like the size of a grade 2, grade 3. He really was a small kid. And that, again, created more humility. Oh, what are you going to do? Call your big brother? I mean, your little brother? So I would have to deal with that kind of thing, realizing that this big older brother really wasn't all that intimidating, all that strong, and became a piece of mockery for me. But the reason why I share that is when you are small, when you are vulnerable, when you are weak, there is nothing you love or appreciate more than having someone beside you who portrays strength and might and power. And the reason why I was kind of reminded of that story in my own childhood was because it kind of goes with the theme or the title that we're going to look at this morning. This title that was given to the coming Messiah, written over 700 years before by the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah, again, said of this coming Messiah in Isaiah chapter 9, and again, we're very familiar with these words, often repeated during the Christmas season, where we read, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." And today we're going to look at that second title, Mighty God. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look, first of all, what's the actual meaning of that term, Mighty God. Secondly, we'll look at what this might look like or why the people in Isaiah's day, when he was giving this sign, why that would have brought them encouragement and comfort. Thirdly, what this might have looked like, or what people may have thought of this in Jesus' day or Mary and Joseph's day when Jesus came into this world in Bethlehem, and then by looking at how Jesus exemplifies this picture of mighty God. But first of all, let's just kind of look at this definition of mighty God. And sometimes when you're translating from another language into a different language, so from Hebrew into English, you lose a little bit in translation. And so I'm actually going to break out a little bit of Hebrew for you this morning, and mainly the only reason why, because these are two actual Hebrew words that I can pronounce, and if I can pronounce them, there's a good chance you guys can pronounce them. But the word mighty God in Hebrew is El Gabor. I'm going to let you say that with me. El Gabor. Okay, so the first part, El, that's just the Hebrew word for God, kind of the generic word for God. So here's a little neat tidbit. Whenever you hear somebody's name and they've got an L in their name, so for example, Michael, Daniel, Gabrielle, there's a good chance that that name has something to do, the original meaning of that name has something to do with God. It fits in it some way or other. So that's the God portion. But the word that I want to focus on this morning is the word Gibor. And again, this is the word where the English doesn't quite do it justice. We think of mighty, and mighty is just, might even think of that as just as a generic word for strong, for powerful. Often when we think of, in our English language, we just sort of use abstract terms. Hebrew is a much more visual language. They sort of used, so when they talk about strength, sometimes they would be talking like a mighty fortress, right? A fortress, or as a rock, right? They would use kind of picture images to convey strength. And the word Gibor, every time it is used in Scripture, actually is used for a specific type of strength, specifically military strength. In fact, the word often is translated from Gibor into English as warrior. It really is saying not just a mighty, strong, generic, powerful God, but literally a warrior God. But not just really any kind of warrior God, but the top elite of the elite warrior gods, right? A God with strength and military power that is without equal. So for example, in modern days, you would think this, okay, what kind of military strength are we talking about? We're talking about like, the Navy SEALs, the Delta Force, that kind of level of elite. The very first time this word is used in Scripture, Gibor, is used to describe someone with a very unfortunate name, Nimrod. But we are told that Nimrod was a mighty warrior, mighty hunter. It's kind of funny when I there was none without equal to Nimrod. When I think of the name Nimrod, which is quite unfortunate, I can't help but think of that old Johnny Cash, A Boy Named Sue song. Like if your parents were going to name you something that cruel, like a name like that, you better be tough. So Nimrod lived up to his name because he was extremely tough. But probably the best place where this was pictured is in 2 Samuel 23, where you meet literally David's 30 mighty men. And he describes the top brass of his military. They're called the Giborim, right? These mighty men. Let me give you an example of who we're talking about. I just picked out two of them to describe my personal two favorite. First was Abishai. He said, Abishai, he raised his spear against 300 men whom he killed, and so became as famous as the three. And then the next one is a guy by the name of Benaiah. I love Benaiah. Benaiah was a valiant fighter from Kabzeel who performed great exploits. He struck down two of Moab's best men. He also went down into a pit on a snowy day and killed a lion. He struck down a huge Egyptian. Although the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, Benaiah went against him with a club. He snatched the spear from the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. Such were the exploits of Benaiah. He too was as famous as the three mighty men. He was held in greater honor than any of the 30, but he was not included among the three. And David put him in charge of his bodyguard, right? This is the kind of Gibor that when we hear about mighty, that God is talking about to describe him. I love that picture. It's like, yeah, this guy killed 300 guys. This guy beat up a lion on a snowy day, went into a pit and wrestled a lion. When it comes back to the debating whose dad is the strongest, these guys' dads win every time, hands down. But then it's like, yeah, but there's three guys even tougher than those guys. Right? Like, these are tough, scary-looking machines of people. And again, it's this idea, not just generic God as strong, but quite literally a warrior God who comes and fights on our behalf. Well, let's consider what this would have looked like in Isaiah's day, and then also what this may have looked like in Mary and Joseph's first century Israel day. Well, first in Isaiah's day, and I didn't do this in Bob Cajun last week. I think it kind of fits better for this week, so this might be a little bit of review. But oftentimes when we got to be careful when we read these ancient prophetic texts, specifically this one from Isaiah, it's easy to kind of read it and go, okay, well, what does that mean for us? When we realize those words were given to a specific audience at a specific time, going through specific circumstances. And so the idea is, well, what would that have meant? How would that have come across to those original people hearing Isaiah's words? Well, let me just give you a little bit of a background in Isaiah's day. At this time, Ahaz was king of the southern area of Israel in the land of Judah. He was a descendant of David, probably about 300 years after the time of David, but he was a descendant of King David. And this is where things get confusing in the Old Testament because for a period of just about nearly 300 up until just around Ahaz's time, from the time of, after Solomon to the time of literally Ahaz, the nation of Israel was split in two. There was Judah and Benjamin who stayed to the south. They had Jerusalem and they kept the Davidic king. But the other tribes, the other 10 tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel were to the north. They were kind of bigger and stronger, and they sort of rejected the Davidic kingship. And they said, we're going to create our own kingship. We're going to create our own capital, and we'll have our own, kind of have our own sort of little political system. And so they were separated for a long history. Well, at this time, this is kind of nearing the end of the northern kingdom's life. They were by far the bigger and they were the stronger. And in typical Big Brother fashion, they were a bunch of bullies. And what they were doing is they were bullying the South. In fact, what they were doing is they would be coming in, they would be raiding, coming from the north, they would be raiding parts of Judah, stealing from them. They would be exacting tribute, meaning, hey, we will, not beat you up if you pay us off. That was kind of how it was going, sort of a bit of an extortion theme. But at this time, also, the northern kingdom also created an alliance with one of the surrounding nations, the surrounding of Aram, and they started to threaten. They say, hey, why don't we come together, you help us out, and we'll take over the south once and for all. We will take over Judah. We will reclaim Jerusalem. And it didn't look good, right? It looked pretty scary, and there was no way at that time that Judah could really defend itself, especially now that the older Israel northern tribes were in alliance with this outside nation. So they called on Isaiah. They called out to God. He goes, please let us know you will protect us. You won't abandon us. You will save us. And here's the amazing thing. Here's the response. And if you go back a couple chapters to Isaiah 7, you'll be familiar with some of these words. Then Isaiah said, hear now, you house of David, is it not enough to try the patience of men? Will you try the patience of my God also? And then verse 14, you'll be familiar with these words. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. He said, here's this thing. Yes, everything looks dark. Everything looks bleak. But the Lord is going to give you a sign to let you know that he is with you, that he's not going to abandon you. And he gives them this perfect sign, because when you are intimidated, when there's a big military force that's threatening to oppress you, the one thing you want, the one secret weapon that will make you sleep well in bed at night is a baby, right? Because nothing is more intimidating than a baby and its virgin mother, right? But he says this sign of this miraculous birth is going to be the sign that God is with you and that he's going to be fighting on your behalf. And then when we jump ahead, and apparently after this child is born, and we read these words about this child. For unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. Now here's the unique thing. There's a little bit debate of, okay, who was this child? Who is this miraculous child in Isaiah's day? Most people will argue that it was probably and best likely was King Hezekiah. He would be the future king after Hezekiah, who was one of the great, from the house of David, one of the great kings in the history of Israel. But it's an amazing thing, even regardless of that, the history of the Jewish people, they looked at that prophecy of Isaiah and said, yeah, we see how it fits, but I think this points to something to a day even bigger and greater than the day that we're facing. It's pointing to yet even a future Messiah still to come, right? These names are too big. We can't quite hold them together for just Hezekiah, just for another regular king from the line of David. But here's the absolutely amazing thing of what happened in Isaiah's day. You see, when there's a bully, the scary thing is often there is a bigger bully. And so within about 10 years of Isaiah uttering these remarks, the big bad bullies on the street was a nation called Assyria. And Assyria, shortly after this, came in and totally wiped out the northern kingdom, right? Also wiped out the surrounding nations. Basically, it left little old Judah by itself, kind of reclaiming the mantle of, being God's Israel. And for a number of decades, it lived in pretty safe prosperity and peace. Unfortunately, eventually, Assyria returned, and this time it had its eyes focused on little old Judah and was about to wipe it out. And again, you read in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles and also in Isaiah this phenomenal victory that God gave Judah over this massive superpower of the day, Assyria, and literally led to the demise of this once great empire. And again, after that, King Hezekiah was the king at that time, and again, which led to an incredible time of peace and prosperity, where Hezekiah was is still remembered as one of the great kings of Israel. But it's that little picture, that this symbol of this coming baby was a reminding that God is with you, Emmanuel. And the way he's going to be with you is he's going to fight on your behalf. In fact, he used sort of a bully to beat up the bullies. But what would this mean in Mary and Joseph's day? I think in many ways it would have been thought of in very much in the same way that it would have been thought about in Isaiah's day. However, in many ways, in Mary and Joseph's day, in that first century Israel, there was another bully, and the bully was even a bigger and greater threat than just, big brother northern Israel and those other tribes. It was the bully of the Roman Empire. And Israel at that time was just a small kind of little puppet state in this vast, massive empire. And watching over the land of Israel was a horrendous king. We often really think of him as Herod the Great, but he was more, in truth, if you know anything about Herod the Great, it would be Herod the Not So Great at all. And then when he was gone, it was Herod the Not So Great sons who took over his reign. But the people of Israel, the Jewish people, lived under a very oppressive, under the thumb and under the boot heel of this Roman Empire. And at that time, there was a lot of belief, a lot of crying out, a lot of calling out, looking out. God, this must be the sign that you will be sending your Messiah, the one who is going to come and save your people, who will rescue us. And everyone had in their mind just sort of the way that God rescued them in Isaiah's day, but also in this idea, in this line of David, that he was going to be an El Gabor, God Almighty, a warrior God who's going to come in and defeat the bad guys, right? He's going to take away the glory of the house of Caesar and reestablish the house of David. One of the reasons why that I think so many of the Jewish people in the first century rejected Jesus as Messiah is because, first and foremost, they believed that this Messiah is not going to be so much a religious figure as he was going to be a political and especially a military figure. One, again, who's going to reclaim, primarily through the sword, kind of like David, the glory of Israel. Imagine just, again, during this time, a number of people who people believed and who claimed the Messiah mantle stood up, and they thought, maybe we could follow this one, only to have them being humiliated and executed by the power of Rome. Well, just imagine as Jesus grows up and he's getting more and more famous, and he's being known as a great teacher, he's being known as a great wonder worker. And probably the most famous message that he ever spoke, we think of it as the Sermon on the Mount. But we know that people came from all over. They probably would have maybe traveled days to be able to see, to be able to hear this prospective Messiah. Could this be the new king that we've been awaiting? And then, as Jesus starts these words, as they're all listening, imagine what it would have been like to hear these words. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who are hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Why should we be merciful? Nobody's shown us mercy. Blessed are the peacemakers. We don't want a peacemaker. We want a warmonger, God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Right? Wait a minute. This is the Messiah? This is the El Gabor, the mighty God, warrior God? If this is blessing, God, you've kind of poured out way too much blessing on your people, Israel. If this is a blessing, please give us a curse, because we don't want this. Right? Even Jesus' disciples didn't understand it. Right? When they're arguing who's going to be first, they're expecting Jesus to set up this kingdom. He says, you don't get it. Right? You don't like it when the other people lord it over you, the Romans lord it over you. But the Son of God didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is not what you expect. So how did Jesus demonstrate being a warrior God, this mighty God, this El Gabor? I was trying to think of this as I was thinking of that, and there's a couple ways I thought of it. The first one is, well, yeah, Jesus, when we think of Christmas and we think of the baby that we celebrate at Christmas time, this is not the image that we normally think of. We don't think of warrior God. We like the Prince of Peace God, this nice little soft, gentle baby in the swaddling clothes and the mangers and angels and shepherds, and it's just nice and safe. We like safe Jesus, safe God. And we don't see when Jesus came, he got upset in the tabernacle, at the temple, threw over the tables, but he doesn't wield a sword. He didn't go and attack people. That's more Muhammad style, if you kind of know the history of Muhammad, than Jesus. Jesus, but he went toe-to-toe with some of the religious leaders, and he took them on, and he defended the cause of those like women and crippled and sinners and lepers and tax collectors and so forth. But as I thought more about it, and I thought about our military heroes and what we celebrate military strength, well, there were two things that came to my mind. First is the more obvious one. When I think of, those 30 mighty men of David, the Giberim, right? I think of like the Benaiah, the guy who just walks into the pit, and wrestles a lion with his hands, the guy who sees this giant Egyptian, hits him with a stick, takes a spear and kills him with it. We like that, the guy who will go in and fight the enemy on our behalf, right? We give them the weapons, we give them the artillery, and we know they're going to go out and defeat the bad guys. And that's part of it. But part of being a mighty warrior is not just being the ones who take the shot, shoot the bullets. The other one's side that, again, we also don't think of, we think of gratefully with days like Remembrance Day, which we just honored a month ago. It's also the ones who put themselves in harm's way, who are the ones who can also take the bullet on our behalf to protect the others. It was interesting this week, we were in our men's study, we were doing Ephesians, and we were looking at one of the references that in the video that we were watching referenced D-Day. And it made me think about D-Day, wanted to just do a little bit more of investigating. And obviously when we think of the end of World War II, we usually think of D-Day as sort of the start of that, like that decisive battle of Normandy, which really kind of marked the end of World War II, at least on the European front over the Germans. But I thought, well, what were the casualties of the invasion of Normandy? And I looked up, and it was roughly 425,000 were either killed or critically injured. 210,000 from the Allied forces, roughly 200,000 Germans troops, and somewhere between 15 and 20,000 civilians. And here's this day that we kind of celebrate and we honor as kind of the victory, as marking the end of World War II. But it was a victory that came with incredible cost. And one of the ways that we acknowledge those heroes is because we know that so many of them, before they took the beaches of Normandy, many of them knew that there's a good chance they were never going to come home. And if they came home, it wasn't going to be to a parade of cheers, but in a box with a flag draped over it. And part of being a hero, part of being a Gabor, is taking the risk and putting yourselves in harm's way. Being not just the one who takes the shot, but the one who quite literally takes the shot personally, taking the bullet. And when Christ came, this little baby, he put himself in harm's way. He took the bullet of the cross of Calvary on our behalf. He put himself between the evil of sin and the judgment of God and took it to save us from it. It's an incredible picture. That is a mighty God, a mighty warrior who risks himself, who puts himself in harm's ways to save others, to save us. But then I was thinking, well, what about the one who wields the sword and the power? And we realize if we just end with the Gospels and we just end with the cross and resurrection, it doesn't really quite tell the full story. Because the very last picture we see of our mighty God, our El Gabor, our warrior God, actually doesn't come from the Gospels, it comes from the book of Revelation. And it tells us that there will be no mistake when this Messiah returns, that he is in fact El Gabor, warrior God. Listen to this picture of this Jesus we worship. Revelation 19, verse 11. I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and makes war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one else knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has this name written: King of Kings and Lord of Lords. This Christmas season, as we think of that little baby born in Bethlehem, never underestimate the power of the God and the Messiah we worship. He is El Gabor, mighty God, warrior God. I'm going to call the worship team to close our service off with What Child Is This?